Good morning, and welcome to this week's episode of Senior Living Today. I'm your host, Jeff Rokisky, along with attorneys Dave Wilharm and Christopher Blair. Our viewers will notice a change in that Kelly McCoy is no longer our host. She's retired, and we want to thank her for being our host for all of these years. We will miss her, and I know our viewers will miss her too. A little bit about our law firm, Rokisky, Wilharm, Blair, and Rokisky before we get started. We have offices in Weirton and Wheeling, West Virginia. Our firm primarily practices in the areas of elder law and oil and gas law, and for many years our firm has been recognized as the best of the best by readers of the Weirton Daily Times in both of these fields. Our firm also has a radio show on WWVA on Saturday mornings titled It's Your Legacy, wherein we discuss many of the same issues that we talk about on this show. If you have a question that you would like us to discuss, you can send it to us through our website at rokiskilaw.com. If you would like an appointment with any of our attorneys to discuss any of these issues or any other legal issues that may concern you, you may call our main office in Weirton to schedule a free initial appointment. Okay, gentlemen, let's get started with our show. Dave, our first question is from Ann in Wheeling, and Ann asks, with the change in the presidency, are there any changes to the laws that I should be aware of that could affect my estate plan?
Well, there certainly are going to be some changes. I guess first and foremost, anytime you have a Republican-controlled presidency and Congress, you can expect there to be a run at the federal estate tax. That's been the ultimate yo-yo that's gone back and forth depending on who's in control. Going from as low as $600,000 up to where it currently sits at $5.5 million. I think all of the pundits expect that that's going to go away at some point under the Trump administration, that we will no longer have a federal estate tax. That being said, realistically, at least in our area, I don't know that the federal estate tax has much impact on many individuals. At $5.5 million a person, that's a pretty substantial estate, and something that quite frankly we don't see a whole lot of here. That's the rare find to have to deal with that issue. I think the bigger issue and the bigger concern that I have is what's going to happen in the Medicaid field. There's already some movement to deal with the Medicaid qualifying annuities, which really is a major planning tactic that we would use for a married couple. It's our ability to take assets that a couple has accumulated and turn them into what Medicaid would call a stream of income to protect almost really all of the assets of a couple in the event that one of the spouses needs nursing home care. There's a move now to take that situation. So the reason it works, why it works, is the Medicaid is willing to say whoever receives that income from the annuity, that's their income. And so when we look at Medicaid eligibility, we're only concerned with the income of the individual who's on Medicaid. So if you have a husband and wife, and husband is in the nursing home and is on Medicaid, and he's getting Social Security, and wife is living at home and she has a Medicaid annuity that's paying her $5,000–6,000 a month, Medicaid's not concerned with what she's getting, and she's able to be eligible or he's able to be eligible for Medicaid. What the change that they're pushing right now is they're trying to say, we're going to take those Medicaid qualifying annuities and we're going to make it half husband, half wife. And so now on a monthly basis, if you try to use an annuity, you would not be able to save all the money like you're able to now. You would instead be paying, half of that annuity stream every month would be going towards the cost of care. So if that happens, the ability for people to really not plan, while we already don't advise that, it would get much more costly because now we would not have the ability to use that annuity, and you would be looking at a situation where if you don't plan, you can probably count for about half your assets going towards the cost of care before you're able to really fully realize the benefit of Medicaid.
Right. So we talk all the time about setting up irrevocable trust, and at the same time, at some point maybe in the conversation with our clients, if they're married, we refer to the Medicaid qualifying annuity. And your point is well taken that I think sometimes there's a temptation on behalf of our clients to say, well, why do I need to set up an irrevocable trust if the Medicaid qualifying annuity is out there as kind of a fallback in a crisis situation? And you know, now that we have this change in administration, this is kind of what we've been talking about all along. Yeah, Medicaid qualifying annuities are great. First of all, if they're still permissible, and there's a chance that at least in some way they'll be scaled back. And secondly, these Medicaid qualifying annuities only work for married couples. So you know, if you have a husband and wife who are relying on using a Medicaid qualifying annuity, and then the husband or wife dies, you know, that under the current law is not an option to them. So I think I always tell my clients, our first move, our A move, is to move as much money as you can to an irrevocable trust, and hope that you make it 5 years or close to 5 years before you need long-term care, because you never know.
Right, you want to buy that flexibility. That's really what it's all about.
Right.
And now some of the flexibility that we have, if that's taken away, it really becomes your only option now.
Right.
Is to pre-plan out in advance and use a trust to move those assets. Because if you don't, you're going to spend them.
Right. And you know, and then sometimes some of our clients think, well, there's no way that I or my spouse or my parents can make it 5 years before they need long-term care. And I try to explain to our clients, look, you know, again, you start with the proposition that there's a likelihood that you could make it 5 years, and if you come back to the office 4 years and 9 months after you've set up the irrevocable trust and tell us that, you know, your loved one needs to go into a nursing home, you're 3 months away from being protected. So the way out in that instance is you just private pay for that final 3 months. Now you're past the 5-year look back. Now you can apply for Medicaid and be eligible. So certainly, if you're sitting with clients and they, you know, it's pretty clear that it's not going to be 3 or 6 months before they need long-term care. It probably doesn't make sense to set up an irrevocable trust. But you know, for anybody who thinks there's a realistic opportunity they can make it 5 years or close to 5 years, it really is kind of, I think, the go-to move for elder law attorneys across the nation. Okay, Chris, next question is from Renee in Weirton. Renee says, I know the oil and gas industry has tried for several years to get forced pooling legislation passed in West Virginia, but has failed in all of their attempts. Will they try again, or is the issue finally dead in the water?
Well, that's a very good question, and one with a loaded answer. Mm-hmm. As many are aware, the oil and gas industry over the last 5 to 7 years has attempted 5 times to push forced pooling legislation into law in West Virginia, and they have failed at all of their attempts. Mm-hmm. And what forced pooling is a tool, legal tool used by the oil and gas operators to force or compel landowners who haven't otherwise entered into a lease with a company to actually lease with that company when the oil and gas company has a certain number of acres or percentage of acres leased around that particular landowner. So if the landowner's holding out for certain terms or for whatever reason does not want to lease with a company, and that company has, say, 75% of the acres around that individual, they can force that individual into a lease. That's what forced pooling is. And forced pooling exists in areas in this region and throughout the country, but it does not exist for shallow wells in West Virginia, and mm-hmm. Marcellus is a shallow well. So it's important for them to have that leverage because it essentially is eminent domain rights for the oil and gas company. Mm-hmm. So they're not pushing forced pooling directly as they have been in prior years this year. The current legislative session, which is going on right now, they've kind of pivoted a little bit, and they're really focusing on 2 provisions or 2 subparts of that former forced pooling legislation, that being co-tenancy issues and joint development of old leases. Mm-hmm. As it currently stands, well, they've done this through the introduction of Senate Bill 244 into the Senate, and what that says is it tries to change the co-tenancy laws and the joint development laws of old leases that currently exist. As it currently stands, in order to lease and drill on property in West Virginia, if there is a fractional interest in a piece of property, so there's multiple owners in a piece of property, they have to have 100% of those individuals, those co-tenants, leased in order to drill on that property. They are trying to, Senate Bill 244 takes that 100% threshold down to 51. A mere simple majority could force those non-participating or non-consenting co-tenants into a lease. And then the other part of that, the joint development section of the new Senate Bill 244 states that for anybody who has old oil and gas leases that were entered into prior to the advent and widespread use and acceptance of horizontal drilling, a lot of these leases did not have adequate pooling language, so that they cannot go down beneath the ground and horizontally drill and efficiently and effectively drill from a large area, a large pool of land. So what they've had to do as an industry is go back to these oil and gas, or these landowners, and either enter into new leases or try to modify their current old lease to include that pooling language. So essentially they need something from the landowner that wasn't negotiated prior. And a lot of times the landowner, and I think justifiably so, wants paid for that because they're giving rights up that they maintain. The new joint development law states that if an operator if they own these oil and gas leases on adjoining property and they don't have that appropriate pooling language, this law will impliedly put in that pooling language to allow them to pull and drill from that property. Basically taking away the landowner's ability and their negotiation power, their leverage when negotiating with the company, because they're trying to get maybe better terms, because this lease was signed well before forced pooling was an issue and was, like I said, widespread use of it. And so it's an important, very controversial topic, and following it through the legislative session, it hasn't been getting much traction. There's been a lot of opposition, mainly from the West Virginia Royalty Owners Association and other surface right counterparts are vehemently in opposition of this bill. And obviously the West Virginia Oil and Gas Association, the lobbyists for the oil and gas industry, are for it. So they've been butting heads. And so while it didn't get much traction, another Senator Trump in West Virginia, brought the two sides together, West Virginia Oil and Gas Association, West Virginia Royalties Owners Association, and try to hash out the differences. So a new bill, Senate Bill 576, was introduced by Senator Trump, which tried to meet in the middle. And they've changed a couple things. The co-tenancy requirement, instead of being a simple majority of 51%, they raised that to 2/3 percentage. And they've made some other changes, but it's a hot topic issue that is not going to die anytime soon. And we know the legislative session ends in West Virginia on April 8th, which is fastly approaching. So you got to stay tuned. We want to make sure we let our listeners and our viewers know that if you have strong feelings with this proposition, this new proposed legislation, that you need to make sure you voice your opinions and you call your local representatives to make sure that they hear you. So there's a lot at stake. So the current law is they need 100% of the owners of the certain parcel in order to lease, and with the joint development, they are basically going to imply pooling language if they meet the requirements of the statute.
One of the quotes that I loved was from a representative of the West Virginia Farm Bureau when they came out with the initial proposed legislation, and I think he described it as the same pig with different lipsticks. So Farm Bureau was not happy with it. But let me ask you guys this. So Ohio's had forced pooling. How would you explain to our viewers how that's worked out from our experience?
Well, so in Ohio the process is a little bit different. So it's 65%. They have to go. It's semi-judicial. It's really more of a government agency holding the hearings. It's been my experience, at least so far, that I think neither side, kind of a typical court settlement, right? Neither side has been real happy with what has happened in those situations. The courts have given royalties that have been, more in line with kind of what the unit was doing. The courts have sometimes given a bonus payment, sometimes have not. There's, the statutory structure is a little bit different, so that you have this concept called a carried interest in Ohio that isn't part of any of this stuff that we're talking about in West Virginia, where essentially the owner who's getting forced in gets to be treated as though they're an operator. They get to share in the complete profit from their oil and gas once a certain percentage of the oil and gas has been recovered. Now the company, or the courts have been using that a lot. So the carried interest has been a big part of the rulings. And quite frankly, I don't think the operators like it, because once they get 200% of their investment back, they really don't get anything from that property. The landowner gets or the mineral owner gets the rest of it. And so, I don't know that it's a real fair comparison between the two. In West Virginia, so if you own your property outright, you're still, I guess, not subject to this co-tenancy. Right now, if you share ownership, you're at risk under this bill. Depending on what the percentages are, you could get forced in. I think one of those trade-offs was the royalty, and whether or not it's going to be a gross royalty or a net royalty, how you calculate the royalty. I mean, it seems like a simple concept until you start digging down and say, okay, I own a piece of property, I don't want to lease it, I'm 35%. You guys own the other part of it, and you guys have entered into a lease. Well, what do I get? What if you two were knuckleheads and you took a 12.5% net deal, and I was really holding out because I wanted a 20% gross deal? What do I get paid? And so there's been some compromise on that type of stuff that says you get the average, but you can't get less than gross, and you can't get less than 12.5%. I mean, I don't think it's been thought all the way through. I think all the situations that could arise still, there's a lot to be ironed out on.
And I think my concern is that the legislatures, God bless them, aren't knowledgeable enough in the operation of these leases to really develop a good body of law. I think that what I would rather see is attorneys who are knowledgeable in the area of oil and gas from both sides, not just from the landowner side, but those attorneys who represent the oil and gas companies, to try to get together and come up with some sort of informed compromise. So we'll stay tuned for that. But like Chris said, it's an important subject, and you just don't, if you're a landowner, you just don't want to find out one day that the law's changed and you haven't had a say in the matter.
Right, and right now it's being fast-tracked, so I mean they move on these things quickly. So certainly again, tell our clients and our listeners here to make a phone call to their representative and make sure they know what's going on.
Right.
And the short answer to that question is real easy. The industry will never let that die.
Yes.
It'll never be dead. You can defeat it every single year, and they're going to come back every year with a new version and claiming to address the concerns.
Could have saved about 15 minutes of discussion if we just started there, right? Okay, next question is for Dave from Ray in Moundsville. Ray wants to know, I do not own my oil and gas, and a gas company wants to put a well pad on my property. Can I prevent the company from using my property, and if not, am I entitled to receive any compensation for the use of my property?
Well, he might be able to prevent the use of his property. So with the ownership of minerals comes with it the idea that if I own minerals, it doesn't do me any good to own them if I can't access them. So we have a reasonable surface use type of law that says that I'm entitled to reasonably use the surface of the property to develop my minerals. Where the dispute starts to come in is, okay, you can reasonably use the surface of the property to develop the minerals, but what about the fact that in the current setting, we're talking about putting a 15-acre well pad on a piece of property, and it's going to benefit not just maybe the mineral owner, but mineral owners within a mile. You have a 640 or 1,280 acre drilling unit. So there's a very good argument out there that says that unless that particular piece of property was part of something much, much bigger, So the whole unit essentially at the time of the severance was this piece of property. I think you have a very good argument that you can stop and force the company to either look elsewhere or ultimately kind of pay the price tag that you want to pay to have a drilling site on your property that you're not going to get received. There are people out there who don't want property, the pad on the property, and they're going to receive the royalties. So you can imagine somebody who owns a piece of property, doesn't own the oil and gas, isn't going to receive any royalties, and next thing you know, there goes 15 acres. Which kind of gets to the second part of the question: is if I can't stop them, what's my remedy? And it really is, you're entitled to damages. There's a statute in place that would require the company to compensate the surface owner for the loss of the use of the surface. The problem is unless you're really generating cash from that, the measurement of damages is probably not going to be adequate. You're going to get into the same type of argument that we get into in eminent domain cases with pipeline, and you're not just taking the 15 acres, but what about all the property around it I can't use, that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, I think people are not going to be happy with the level of compensation they receive if they don't own the minerals and they're just having their surface taken away.
And that's going to become more and more of an issue as we start to see drilling activity pick up in the region. So it's going to be a hot topic. Okay, next question is for Chris from Brad in Warwood. Brad says, my great aunt Margaret just passed away and named my cousin and I as executors in her will. I live close to Aunt Margaret, but my cousin lives in California. Since we are both executors, can I handle everything, or does he have to travel in from California to handle this matter along with me?
Well, it will matter what the language in the will says. You're certainly able to have multiple people serve in that executor role when the executor is the person who is selected by the testator, the decedent, to handle and wind up his or her last affairs. So like I said, you can select a single or multiple individuals, and depending on how you word the will depends on whether each individual has the right independently to handle some of these matters, or do they have to do so jointly. So if the language said or, person one or person two, or if it stated specifically, expressly in the will that these individuals are to be co-executors but have independent authority to act. So depending on the will, they likely are going to have to probably do it together unless, like I said, it has those specific words in the lease. Now if it's, this happens from time to time, great aunt Margaret loves her family and wants, doesn't want to pick one over the other, so she puts both of them in there, not aware that one of these individuals lives across the country. In an instance like that, if it's going to be more difficult to serve together, the individual who lives in California can file what we call a renunciation and file the renunciation within the court, thereby relinquishing his right to serve as executor of her estate, and then let the other co-executor handle the matter.
Right. Okay, good. Next question is for Dave from Martha in Fallensby. Martha says, Dave, I have all of my bank accounts set up as payable on death and my house with a transfer on death deed. Why do I need a trust?
Well, those are all what we would call non-probate transfers. So that's a good setup if your only goal is, I don't want somebody to have to probate a will. The problem with that is, of course, that's not always our sole goal when we're trying to do estate planning. That's part of it. That's part of why we do a trust. But the bigger reason why we typically do a trust is we're trying to protect our assets from the cost of long-term care. And that type of setup really doesn't do anything to protect assets in a long-term care situation. You'd be subject to spend down on all of them. The other thing that I think is probably worth pointing out on that is, when we do a trust, the trust gives us that kind of single place where we can make changes. I know we call them irrevocable trusts, and most people think you can't make any type of change. But as we know, we can make some changes through powers of appointment that change the ultimate beneficiaries of the trust. Thereby, if we have a change and we have bank accounts with multiple people and we have a house with multiple people, if I want to make a change, I have to go all over the place and make all those types of changes. If everything's going to a trust and I can make a change just in the trust, then that's ideal, because now I don't have to worry that, I forgot to make the change on the life insurance, and now one of the beneficiaries got all the life insurance, and another one got left off. So it's nice to have the ability to make that change in just one place.
Well, in a few minutes that remain, let me ask this question. So the viewer made these changes to the bank accounts and did the transfer on death deed, which avoids probate. Maybe for some of our viewers who aren't familiar with probate, let's talk about, in a few minutes, why that's a good idea.
Sure. Probate's the process where you lodge the will at the courthouse and you handle the affairs, the last affairs of the decedent. And depending on where you're at, it can be very time-consuming. Even the least amount of time is still too much time to distribute assets. I mean, you're going to be in this process for at least 5-6 months, a lot of times over a year. Whereas if you had a trust, the property would distribute immediately. Going through probate, it's a very public process. So all of your assets, your estate is going to be on file, on record at the courthouse for largely anybody to see. And if you're a private person, you certainly don't want that. And on top of those two things, there's the cost associated with probate can be very, very, very expensive, where it'll pale in comparison to utilizing a trust. A trust will be more than a will on the execution of that, but you're going to save a lot of money in the long run. So just dealing with the aggravation and the inconvenience of having to go through probate is enough to want to try to avoid it.
When you refer to the cost, of course, we're talking about the legal fees that primarily, that if you have a lot of land in Jefferson or Monroe or Belmont County and you own the oil and gas rights, that land's going to be very valuable, and most attorneys base their fees the fees they charge are based on a percentage of what they own, so it can be very, very valuable. It's funny, I have some clients who when I explain, probate involves the money and the time and the publicity, I have some clients who say, look, I'm going to be 6 feet under the ground, what do I care, whether people know my assets or not. And then I have other clients who say, I don't care about the attorney's fees and I don't care about the 12 months that it takes my beneficiary to get the assets, but I'll be darned if my nosy neighbors and family members are going to find out what I owned and where my money went. So everybody has different views on probate, but as a general rule, you should avoid it if at all possible.
Right, and trusts are going to make certain that you avoid probate. You can label assets however you like to avoid probate, but you're always going to be worried about that one situation where maybe your co-owner and any beneficiaries on any account are in the same wrong event where maybe the worst happens and everybody perishes, and then all of those monies will go through your estate and still have to go through probate. So it's a fail-proof way to avoid probate.
Okay, so that is all for this week's show. See you next time on Senior Living Today with the law firm of Rokisky, Wilharm, Blair, and Rokisky.